The air in Havenwood was thick with the scent of sawdust and baking bread, a quiet town nestled so deeply in the valley that it felt forgotten by the rest of the world. Life here moved at the pace of the seasons, each day a gentle, predictable loop of chores and conversation. At the heart of it all was Martha's General Store, a place where people didn't just buy their flour and sugar, they came to exchange small talk and gossip. Martha, with her spectacles perched on her nose and her ledger always at hand, was the silent anchor of this community. She observed everything, meticulously noting down not just transactions, but the subtle shifts in her neighbors' lives. This serene routine shattered one late afternoon in the autumn of 1893. A stranger rode into town, his horse a weary silhouette against the fading light. He was a man of the road, his clothes dusty and his eyes weary but sharp, scanning every face he passed. He introduced himself to the first person he met, a nervous young blacksmith, as Elias Thorne, a private investigator. He was looking for someone who had vanished years ago from a nearby town, a woman named Eleanor Vance. The blacksmith's face went white. He mumbled something about not knowing her and hurried back to his shop, the clang of his hammer suddenly absent. Elias quickly discovered that mentioning Eleanor Vance was like throwing a stone into a still pond. The calm surface of Havenwood rippled with unease. The usual friendly smiles of the townsfolk hardened into a collective, suspicious silence. Elias felt it everywhere, at the saloon, at the post office, and even at the church. They all knew something, but no one was willing to speak. The town's polite tranquility was a carefully constructed facade, and the name Eleanor Vance was the crack that threatened to reveal the rot underneath. Elias knew his answers were hidden here, buried beneath layers of denial and shared guilt, and that he would have to find a way to dig them out. Elias Thorne quickly realized that direct questions about Eleanor Vance were a dead end. The town's residents, though seemingly polite, were masters of avoidance. The local sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Barrett, offered a vague story about Eleanor being a peculiar loner who simply wandered off. The town's schoolteacher, Miss Albright, feigned a sudden coughing fit whenever her name was mentioned. Dr. Finch, the town's reserved physician, merely shook his head and claimed he hadn't seen her in months, his eyes darting away from Elias's gaze. The collective behavior was a masterclass in deflection, a perfectly choreographed performance of shared secrecy. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. They weren't just protecting a memory, they were hiding a crime. Through fragmented bits of gossip and nervous whispers, he pieced together a rough profile of Eleanor. She was known to be eccentric, spending more time in the surrounding woods than in town. She was intelligent and independent, which seemed to be a source of suspicion in Havenwood's tight-knit community. She was different, and that difference had made her an outcast. The most unnerving part was the subtle, unspoken agreement among the townspeople. It was a shared guilt, a collective knowledge that they had all played a part in Eleanor's fate. Their eyes held a mixture of fear and defiance, as if daring him to push for the truth. Elias knew he was hitting a wall. He needed a different approach, a way to see Havenwood not through its people's words, but through its history. And he had a strong feeling that the town's true story wasn't written on its streets, but within the pages of a certain ledger. Having exhausted every lead and met every wall of silence, Elias Thorne's gut instinct guided him to the one person who hadn't yet spoken, Martha. He found her in the quiet heart of her store, where the air was a comforting mix of dried herbs, fresh coffee beans, and old paper. The long wooden counter was a silent witness to a century of small-town life, and behind it stood Martha, her posture straight, her gaze steady. Before her lay her great, leather-bound ledger, a thick, imposing book that seemed less a record and more a living history. It was open to a page filled with her neat, spidery handwriting. Elias approached slowly, the creak of the floorboards the only sound in the stillness. Unlike the other townsfolk, Martha's eyes held no fear or malice, only a profound, watchful quiet. Elias stated his purpose without preamble, laying out the frustrating dead ends he had encountered. "Everyone in this town seems to be guarding the same secret," he said, his voice low. "But I have a feeling the truth isn't in their words. It's in that book." He gestured to the ledger. Every purchase, every transaction. A town's history, recorded one entry at a time. Martha didn't look up from the page. "This isn't just a record of flour and sugar, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dry as parchment. "It's the memory of this town. Every choice, every need, every little detail. It's all written here." She finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made him pause. "And some memories are best left buried." Elias saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep knowledge that went beyond mere gossip. He knew he had found his key. "I am not here to cause trouble," he pleaded, his tone desperate. "I just want to find out what happened to Eleanor Vance. If she's gone, her family deserves to know. If she's alive, they deserve to find her. The people here won't help me, but this book could. Please." The store fell silent again, save for the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall. Martha looked from him to her ledger and back again, weighing his request. The fate of his investigation, and perhaps a town's long-buried secret, rested on her next words. The ticking of the clock in Martha's store was the only sound as she considered Elias's plea. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she slowly nodded. "I will help you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice firm. "But this book does not leave this store. I am its keeper, not its owner. And I will show you what I believe you need to see, nothing more." It was a deal Elias couldn't refuse. Martha turned a few pages, her fingers stopping on a series of entries from years past. They were Eleanor Vance's transactions, a mundane list of sugar, flour, and coffee. But next to some of the items were small, handwritten annotations. Not numbers, but tiny, unfamiliar symbols. "What are these?" Elias asked, leaning closer. "These are not part of the price," Martha explained, her gaze fixed on the page. "This is how I documented what was unusual." She pointed to an entry for dried rosemary, next to which was a small drawing of a twisted root. Eleanor purchased common goods, but also asked for herbs and plants that had no place in a kitchen or a sickroom. Wolfsbane, mandrake, belladonna, things no one else in town ever touched. Elias's mind raced, connecting the dots. He had read enough about old superstitions to know where this was going. "They thought she was a witch," he whispered. Martha's expression was grim. "They didn't just think it, Mr. Thorne. They were convinced of it." Her knowledge of the woods, her reclusive nature, and her strange purchases made her an easy target for their fears. The town was gripped by a kind of quiet hysteria. To them, she wasn't just eccentric, she was a danger. The realization hit Elias with the weight of a stone. This wasn't a case of a person who simply disappeared. It was a story of a town that had actively persecuted one of its own. They had seen something they didn't understand and had decided it was evil. The mundane records in Martha's ledger had just revealed a chilling truth. Eleanor Vance wasn't a runaway. She was a woman driven from her home, condemned by a community blinded by fear. The investigation had just taken a turn from a missing persons case into a far darker tale of collective malice. The revelation of the cursed herbs had opened a door to the town's sinister past, but Elias knew there were more secrets hidden within the ledger's pages. He continued to study the neat lines of Martha's script, his eyes scanning for any other anomalies. His finger stopped on an entry from the same period as Eleanor's strange purchases, but this time, it belonged to a different name, Doctor Finch. Next to the doctor's account was a short, almost missable notation. "One small silver crucifix." Elias looked up at Martha, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, tapping the entry. "Dr. Finch, the man of science? I was told he scoffs at the church. Why would he buy a crucifix?" Martha's expression confirmed his suspicion. "It was the talk of the town at the time, Mr. Thorne. Dr. Finch has always been a skeptic, a man who believed only in what he could see and prove. He saw religion as a crutch for the weak-minded. It was an impossible purchase, completely out of character for him." Elias's mind began to spin, connecting the two pieces of a terrible puzzle. The town was gripped by a belief in witchcraft, a fear that was likely fueled by superstition. But the purchase of a holy relic by a rationalist doctor suggested that the persecution of Eleanor was not just a spontaneous burst of hysteria. It was a planned, deliberate act. The crucifix wasn't for spiritual salvation, it was for a symbolic cleansing, a tool used to validate a heinous act. This implied a conspiracy between the town's religious establishment and its most rational voice, a calculated move to give their fear the stamp of both divine and scientific approval. The simple entry in the ledger was more than a record of a sale, it was proof of a terrible collaboration. The town's leaders hadn't just allowed the witch hunt, they had orchestrated it. The trail no longer led to the woods but to the pillars of Havenwood society. Elias now understood that to find the truth about Eleanor, he needed to uncover the motives behind the crucifix and the roles of the men who felt they had the right to pass judgment. The seemingly innocent purchase by Dr. Finch had just unlocked the next, far more dangerous, layer of the town's secret. With the revelation of Dr. Finch's peculiar purchase, Elias's gaze shifted from the victim to the perpetrators. He and Martha turned to the ledger's records for Reverend Sterling, the town's pastor. The pages revealed a different kind of conspiracy, one cloaked in righteousness. The Reverend's transactions were not for common goods, but for items like large, expensive bundles of candles and specific types of frankincense, all purchased not for public Sunday services, but for private, clandestine gatherings. These purchases began around the same time as Dr. Finch's crucifix and the escalating rumors about Eleanor. He was holding secret meetings, Elias stated, his voice a low growl of realization. He was feeding their fear, using the church to justify their hatred. He painted Eleanor as a sinner and a witch, a blight on the town that needed to be cleansed. The ledger was a silent witness to a campaign of psychological terror, meticulously planned and executed by Havenwood's spiritual leader. Dr. Finch's crucifix now made chilling sense. It was a symbol of validation, a silent pact between faith and reason to condemn a woman who dared to be different. But the most damning evidence was yet to be found. Martha's finger trembled as she turned to a page filled with entries from the day before Eleanor's disappearance. Here were the names of some of the most respected men in town: the blacksmith, the miller, the mayor. Next to each name was a list of seemingly innocent items: 10 feet of good rope, bundle of kindling, heavy-duty sack. The purchases, individually, were harmless. But together, and on that specific date, they formed a chilling tableau. This wasn't a barn-raising. It was a preparation. The full horror of the plan washed over Elias. The town hadn't just been seized by fear, they had been mobilized for an act of collective cruelty. The Reverend had provided the spiritual justification, Dr. Finch the intellectual authority, and the townspeople had provided the tools. The ledger, in its cold, precise way, wasn't just a book of transactions, it was a record of a mob preparing for a ritual of violence. The fate of Eleanor Vance, Elias now understood with bone-chilling clarity, had been sealed long before she vanished into the storm. The evening Eleanor Vance disappeared was a terrible thing. Not just because of the act itself, but because of the storm that mirrored it. Rain fell in sheets, a furious cascade of nature's wrath, and lightning illuminated the sky in jarring, violent flashes. From the window of her store, a silent, solitary vigil, Martha watched as the town's polite facade dissolved. The friendly faces she saw every day were now hardened, their eyes glinting with a mix of fear and righteous anger. They were no longer the peaceful residents of Havenwood, they were a mob. As the thunder rumbled like a warning from a vengeful god, she watched them gather, their figures a grim procession in the downpour. They carried the items from her ledger, now imbued with a sinister purpose: coils of thick rope, bundles of kindling, and tools that were meant for honest work. The flickering light of lanterns danced across their determined faces, revealing the same cold resolve that had been so carefully hidden. She recognized them all: the blacksmith, the miller, even the schoolteacher, Miss Albright, her usual demure posture replaced by a terrifying stiffness. A shout, a single name, Vance, cut through the roar of the wind, and the mob began to move. They were heading toward the woods, their destination unmistakable. Martha pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her heart a drum against her ribs. She had seen the entries in her ledger, she had known what they were planning, and yet she had said nothing. The weight of her silence was a physical burden. She watched as they vanished into the dark, wet embrace of the trees, their voices fading into the sounds of the storm. The store, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. The silence left behind was far louder than the thunder, a screaming emptiness filled with her own guilt and the unknown fate of Eleanor. The items they had purchased from her shelves were no longer mere goods. They were instruments of a terrible collective sin, and she, the quiet keeper of the town's history, had a front-row seat to its darkest night. The day after the storm, the woods were hushed and heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Following the faint, nearly vanished tracks left by the mob, and guided by Martha's vague recollection of Eleanor's preferred hunting grounds, Elias ventured into the heart of the forest. The air was thick with an eerie quiet, the birdsong replaced by the drip of water from the leaves. He felt a profound sense of entering a forgotten, consecrated place. He pushed deeper, his eyes scanning for any sign of a trail. He found it near a secluded ravine, a small, almost invisible path that led to a rock overhang, hidden by a curtain of vines. Pulling the vines aside, he found not a makeshift camp, but a small, carefully constructed shelter. It was an ingenious hideaway, built with knowledge of the land and a deep respect for it. Inside, the shelter was surprisingly dry and organized. A simple cot, a small fire pit, and a scattering of personal effects. But what drew Elias's eye was a collection of notebooks and journals laid out on a flat rock. He picked one up, his fingers tracing the precise, elegant script. They weren't incantations or magical formulas. They were detailed, scientific observations. Meticulous drawings of local ferns, anatomical sketches of woodland animals, and notes on the properties of plants. Eleanor wasn't a sorceress. She was a botanist and a naturalist, studying the very woods the town had accused her of defiling. The cursed herbs from the ledger were not for pagan rituals but for scientific experiments. Her reclusive nature wasn't an act of defiance but a commitment to her research. The truth was as stunning as it was heartbreaking. The townspeople, in their fear and ignorance, had demonized a woman simply because her brilliance was beyond their comprehension. They had hunted her for her curiosity, for her quiet passion for understanding the natural world. Eleanor Vance was not evil, she was a forgotten prodigy. The ledger had not led him to a witch, but to a genius, and the town's crime was 1,000 times more monstrous because of it. Beneath a pile of scientific notes in the hidden shelter, Elias found a smaller, leather-bound book, Eleanor's personal journal. Unlike her precise botanical drawings, the words inside were raw and deeply personal, a chronicle of a life lived in solitary exile. The journal was her voice, a window into the mind of a woman condemned for her curiosity. The pages painted a picture of a quiet, lonely existence. She wrote of her profound love for the woods, of finding solace in the whisper of the trees and the dance of the moonlight on the ravine. But as the entries continued, a darker narrative took hold. She spoke of the townspeople's shifting attitudes, the cold stares that replaced friendly nods, the whispers that followed her down the street. She had felt their eyes on her, their fear a palpable weight she carried every day. The word, which appeared more and more, scrawled on the pages in a shaky, desperate hand. Her writing grew more frantic as the end approached, her words reflecting her escalating terror. She described hiding from neighbors who now crossed the street to avoid her, and her growing realization that her life in Havenwood was no longer safe. Yet, amid the despair, a single entry offered a flicker of hope. She wrote of a person who had seen her not as a monster, but as a person, and had offered her help. She only identified this person by the initial P. She wrote of secret meetings and a promise to guide her to safety, away from the hatred of the town. The final entry was a hurried, panicked scrawl. It mentioned a plan to meet P. on the stormy night of her disappearance. It was a note of desperate hope, a final, fragile tether to the world she was forced to leave behind. The words cut off mid-sentence, the ink smudged by what could have been a drop of water or a tear. Elias closed the journal, his heart heavy with grief. The mystery of Eleanor's disappearance was no longer a puzzle of a missing person, but a human tragedy with a single, tantalizing clue. The identity of P. was the last piece of the puzzle, and Elias knew he had to return to Havenwood to find it. Armed with the journal's final, desperate clue, Elias returned to Martha's store. He laid the journal on the counter, the last entry staring up at them like a silent plea. There was someone who promised to help her, he said, his voice taut with frustration. She called them P. The person who led the mob against her was the same one who offered her hope. We have to find out who it was. Martha, with her intimate knowledge of Havenwood's every inhabitant, began to pore over the ledger once more, her mind replaying every transaction, every interaction. She thought of everyone in town whose name started with P. There was the postman, the pharmacist, but none of them fit the profile of a confidant. Then, a chilling thought struck her. She looked up at Elias, her eyes wide with a terrible realization. P. stands for pastor, she whispered. The only person who would have the trust to befriend a sinner, and still be seen as a holy man in the town, is Reverend Sterling. The revelation was a gut punch. The man who had been the most vocal in his crusade against Eleanor, who had incited the mob, was the very person Eleanor had entrusted with her life. It was a betrayal so profound it defied belief. But the ledger offered a horrifying explanation. The Reverend had been losing his flock's respect, a quiet erosion of his authority. The fear of Eleanor, the witchcraft he could cleanse from the town, was an opportunity for him to reassert his power. By first befriending her, he gained her trust. He could have stolen her scientific notes, seeing them as a potential source of influence or blackmail. His ultimate act was a cold, calculated masterpiece of manipulation. He gained her trust, promised her safety, and then, on the night of the storm, he left her to the mercy of the mob he himself had incited. He didn't just abandon her, he used her as a stepping stone to regain his former prestige. Her disappearance was not a tragic accident, but a premeditated sacrifice. The ledger now contained the full scope of the conspiracy. A town of frightened villagers led by a devious pastor who had betrayed the one person who trusted him most, all for the sake of his own pride. The quiet of Havenwood had been broken. Elias Thorne's presence, once a mere annoyance, was now a tangible threat that stirred the town's sleeping guilt. 4 years, Reverend Sterling and Sheriff Barrett had lived with their secret, buried deep beneath layers of piety and authority. But the stranger's questions, his conversations with Martha, and his disappearance into the very woods where their crime was committed, had resurrected their fear. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that he had found something. The two men met in the sheriff's office, the air thick with paranoia. The Reverend, his face pale and haggard, paced the floor. "He knows," he whispered, the confident orator now a trembling man. "He found her notes. He knows who she was and what we did." Sheriff Barrett, his face a grim mask, sat behind his desk, polishing the star on his chest. "We can't let him talk. If the truth gets out, everything we've built, our lives, our reputations, it all crumbles." The town saw them as heroes, the men who had saved them from a great evil. The truth would reveal them as murderers and liars. Their panic quickly hardened into a desperate plan. They decided to silence Elias once and for all. Just as they had lured Eleanor with a false promise, they would use the Reverend's trusted position to set a trap. He would approach Elias, feigning a crisis of conscience. He would confess, claiming he now wants to help Elias expose the truth and find justice for Eleanor. The plan was simple and cruel. He would arrange a private meeting in a secluded place, likely the sheriff's office, under the guise of a solemn confession. The intent, however, was not absolution, but elimination. "He won't suspect a thing," the Reverend said, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "He's a man who believes in justice. He'll be so focused on his moral crusade that he won't see the trap." Their pact was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared, desperate look of murderous resolve. The hunter had become the hunted. The past was no longer a matter of quiet historical investigation, it was a present and immediate danger. The town's secret was preparing to claim another life. The trap was set. Reverend Sterling, feigning a crisis of conscience, arranged a meeting with Elias at Sheriff Barrett's office. "I need to confess," he had said, his voice trembling with practiced sincerity. "I want to help you find the truth." But Elias was a man who trusted evidence, not please. He knew this was a desperate move, a ruse to lure him into a secluded place. He arrived with Martha, a small, unassuming woman who carried a large canvas bag. The atmosphere inside the sheriff's office was thick with manufactured piety and genuine menace. The Reverend's smile was too wide, the sheriff's hands too still. Elias didn't give them a chance to begin their prepared confession. He placed Eleanor's journal and her scientific notes on the sheriff's desk, their very presence a silent accusation. "I've found all the pieces," he said calmly, his voice low and steady. "I know what happened to Eleanor. I know she wasn't a witch. I know you both conspired against her." The Reverend's face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Elias smiled faintly. "I think you do. And what's more, I've shared everything with someone who will make sure this story gets out, even if I don't leave this office alive." It was a lie, but a powerful one. As they exchanged a quick, panicked look, Martha quietly set her bag on a nearby chair. From it, she pulled a strange, mechanical box with a large horn attached, an Edison phonograph. "I have a feeling you'll want a record of this," Elias continued, his voice now a razor-sharp edge. He turned the crank on the machine. The Reverend, seeing his carefully crafted plan unravel and the cold, unyielding evidence of his duplicity laid bare, broke. His pious mask melted away, revealing the panicked man beneath. He didn't confess out of remorse, but out of a desperate need to justify his actions. He ranted about his lost reputation, the town's respect, and how Eleanor was a threat to everything he had worked for. Every word, every pathetic, self-serving explanation, was captured by the needle on the wax cylinder. The truth, long buried, was finally coming to light, and its sound was the scratching of a needle on a recording. The confession ended. The silence that followed was more damning than any scream. Reverend Sterling's mask of piety was gone, leaving only a shattered man, while Sheriff Barrett stared blankly at the floor. The power they had wielded for so long had evaporated, replaced by the weight of their own recorded treachery. With the wax cylinder in hand, Elias and Martha did not hesitate. The time for private justice was over, the town needed to face its truth. They gathered the community in the town hall, the very same men and women who had bought the rope and kindling. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and unease. They had heard whispers of the confrontation, but they couldn't possibly imagine the horror of the reality. Elias placed the phonograph on a table, its horn pointing towards the crowd like a silent accuser. He said nothing, allowing the machine to speak for itself. The scratching sound filled the room, followed by the Reverend's panicked voice, his words twisted and broken by the machine. The townspeople listened in stunned silence as their beloved spiritual leader confessed to a chilling list of betrayals, orchestrating a witch hunt to save his own reputation, stealing Eleanor's scientific research to pass it off as his own, and luring her to her presumed death. The recording didn't just reveal a conspiracy, it revealed their own complicity. They heard him describe them as pawns in his game, blinded by fear and easily manipulated. As the confession finished, a collective gasp filled the hall. The faces that were once filled with righteous conviction now held only horror and shame. They had believed they were saving their town, purifying it from evil. Instead, they had become the very instruments of that evil. The long-buried secret was now an open wound, and the collective guilt was no longer a shared bond but a crushing burden. The town, built on a foundation of lies and fear, was shattered. The moral authority of the Reverend and Sheriff was gone, their reputations in tatters. The townsfolk, now seeing their leaders for what they truly were, silently turned on them. The verdict was rendered, not by a judge, but by the devastating sound of the truth, and the town's quiet, peaceful facade was gone forever. The morning Elias Thorne rode out of Havenwood was cold and gray, a fitting mirror for the somber mood that had settled over the town. The Reverend and the Sheriff, their authority shattered, were confined to their homes, now objects of pity and scorn. The townspeople, their faces a mixture of shame and anger, were left to reckon with their own complicity. The town, once a picture of idyllic peace, was now a monument to collective guilt. Elias felt no sense of triumph. The truth was out, the villains unmasked, and the victim's name cleared. But the victory felt hollow. He had found a great and terrible secret, but he had lost his belief in simple justice. The human capacity for cruelty and self-deception was a far more complex enemy than he had ever imagined. The case was solved, but the deeper mystery of why people could do such things lingered, a question with no easy answer. His last stop was Martha's store. She was there, as always, behind her counter, the ledger closed and put away. She looked older, the lines on her face etched deeper by the weight of the last few days. Her eyes, once watchful and detached, now held a profound sorrow. They exchanged few words. "You did what was right, Mr. Thorne," she said quietly. "Did I?" he replied, a grim smile on his face. "I found a truth, but what did it solve? Eleanor is still gone. The town is broken. I just replaced one lie with a harder, uglier truth." He left a small payment on the counter, not for a purchase, but for her help. Martha didn't object. They were two people bound by a terrible secret, and their shared burden was the only currency that mattered. As Elias mounted his horse and turned toward the road, he looked back at Havenwood for the last time. It was no longer the town he had arrived in, the quiet, unassuming haven. It was a place of ghosts, haunted by the memory of a woman condemned for her curiosity. He had brought a flicker of light, but he had left in its wake a darkness that would forever stain the town's history. He rode away, a solitary figure burdened not by failure, but by a success that had cost a town its soul and a man his naivety. Years turned into decades. The scandal that shattered Havenwood was not one the town could simply bury or forget. The shame was a poison that seeped into the very soil, and the people, unable to look each other in the eye, began to leave. The quiet haven became a hollow shell, its homes abandoned, its fields overgrown. The streets that once buzzed with life now echoed with the whispers of a terrible past. Havenwood became a ghost town, a monument to a community that couldn't bear the weight of its own truth. The last to leave was a distant relative of Martha, a kind woman who, before she too departed, locked the doors of the store and left a note on the window. Martha's general store, a place that had witnessed so much, became a silent museum. Inside, everything was as Martha had left it: the dusty shelves, the forgotten goods, and on the counter, a single, opened book. The ledger was no longer just a record of transactions. It was the sole surviving testament to what had happened. Its pages, once a secret history, were now a public, open book for any brave enough to venture inside and read. It contained not only the names and prices of daily life, but also the horrifying details of a mob's preparation, the cryptic notes on a brilliant woman's scientific research, and the final, damning words of a betrayed pastor. The story of Eleanor Vance became a local legend, passed down in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear and ignorance. She was no longer remembered as the town witch but as the forgotten prodigy, a victim of a terrible lie. And the ledger, meticulously kept by Martha, the quiet witness, was the proof. It was the legacy of Havenwood, a town that had a monstrous secret and was ultimately destroyed by the simple, brutal power of the truth. It was a stark reminder that some sins are so great that a community cannot outrun them, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to make itself known.